Får jag hypa till på klanscher och sådär?
I pay heed to your needs. Why don't you pay heed to mine when I don't feel like it?
Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming out this very early morning to be inspired about the power of comics. And I would just like to take a moment to tell you how inspired I am by the great creative community that I've met here in Oslo. The folks at Blank Space put together a terrific exhibition of comic art that you should all go see. It should be hanging through May. And also the people at Grafil are really eye-opening for what a community can do in the service of the arts. So I would like to thank everybody at Grafil, Blank Space, Mesh, and Sweet Sound for making this event and this visit possible. So I'm Charles Brownstein. I'm the executive director of an organization called the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, and we are a US-based nonprofit organization that protects freedom of expression in comics. It may seem an oddity, but there are places all over the world, but especially in the United States where we're based, where people are attempting to impose limits upon free expression and what individuals can read and what retailers can sell and what creators can say. And so this organization that I manage is at the front lines of protecting challenges affecting comics and cartoonists. And I'm not going to talk a lot about that today, but I encourage you to go to our website, cbldf.org, to learn more about what's happening all over the world and how you can be a part of raising awareness of these free expression challenges and how you can be a part of making a conversation in your community that expands the power of free expression. I came to comics 20 years ago because the medium is singular, with perhaps the possible exception of music, for being able to have such a short and immediate line between creator and audience. All that's required to make a comic that can reach anybody in the world is your native creativity, something to draw with, some modicum of talent, which, as all of you know as creative people, the more you do, the better you get, and you hate the first thing you made. And that is really it. Everything else beyond there, all of the trappings of publishing, that's really secondary. And it's a lot different from other media. You don't need all of the infrastructure that's required for making motion pictures or television. You don't need all of the infrastructure that's required even for traditional book publishing. All you need is this native idea and access to a copy machine or access to the internet. So the limit of what comics can do is really only the imagination of the people making it and the people receiving it. And as we're seeing now, comics have become a powerful global language for what is a visually oriented 21st century. Here we see just a few different examples of comics communities around the world. Up at top here we've got, of course, the wonderful comics library here in Oslo that I had an opportunity to visit this week. But down here we see a comic book store from Australia. Over on the other side we see a bande dessinée store in Paris. All over the world, people are turning to comics as a mode of visual communication that speaks viscerally and directly to them. Now, of course, more and more people are coming to this medium because it is currently at the heart of mass media. And here you see just a few illustrations, whether it's the Asterix and Obelix movie, whether it's Marvel, Disney's Avengers, or whether it's One Piece selling fried chicken in Japan. Comics and comics ideas are definitely some of the most powerful things happening in the mass media right now, and they're reaching untold millions who are now coming to the source material and getting inspired by the creative inspiration of the individual hands that made those comics. But beyond the product aspects of it, what's so interesting, at least to me, about comic books is their ability to tell a broad diversity of stories for a broad diversity of audiences. Here's just a few examples of personal narrative in comics. Yoshiro Tatsumi's A Drifting Life is his narrative of coming of age as an artist at the birth of manga and showing the struggle to create a new medium. Alison Bechdel's Fun Home is a frequently challenged, extremely important book that tells the story of an artist coming of age and coming into her own as an adult, as a human dealing with her own homosexuality, with her father's homosexuality, and with the community's responses around it. Or Uli Lust's Today is the Last Day of the Rest of Your Life. These stories are just the tip of an iceberg that includes thousands and thousands of narratives where the individual talent of the creative artist is able to channel their emotions and their worldview onto the page through the handwriting of the inked line. But beyond even the personal narrative, comics have the capacity to go anywhere in time. And so here we have just a few examples of comics as historical narrative. Osamu Tezuka's Buddha, which is one of the great masters' hundreds of comics, this one telling the story of the life of the historical Buddha. This astonishing new graphic novel about Edvard Munch that I just picked up here and am extremely moved by, uses the comics technique to illustrate the way that art history behaves and the way that art is inspired. So comics is able to get into the mind of the artist and convey it in a way that is compelling for the reader, that can create empathy for a process that perhaps some people do not encounter. Or Marjane Satrapi's Persepolis takes you inside what it is to be a young girl in revolutionary Iran and tells her story in a way that is universal for readers all over the world. So comics can take you into these places that are very specific in time, into these processes that are very specific to the individuals being depicted. And the way that this is different from something like film or television, which are great media unto themselves, is that the power of the comics page creates an intimacy between the artist and the viewer that happens in the bond of the printed page, or the bond now of the screen, of course, where the action plays out within your mind and you fully inhabit this visual world. And speaking of visual worlds, comics, of course, are extraordinarily well known for being able to give flight to the imagination in a way that is prohibitively expensive if you're talking about other visual media, but within the comic book page, you can create pantheons, as Neil Gaiman did in Sandman. You can traverse the world and create new and inventive ways of seeing it, as Hergé did in Tintin, or even go out into the future and create both these great science fiction settings as well as allegories about the human heart, as Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples do in Saga. So these are all illustrations of what is occurring within the graphic novel form. But the thing is, the comics are so much more than that, as I alluded to at the very beginning of this. All of these are produced within the traditional infrastructures of publishing, and fortunately that infrastructure is getting stronger every day. You can walk into any bookstore here and find comics and graphic novels on the shelf. In fact, you can walk into pretty much any bookstore in the world and find comics and graphic novels on the shelf, which was not the case as recently as 20 years ago, at least in my home country of the USA. And so the form is growing. The form is speaking increasingly to this visual century. But beyond even that, the capacity of comics to provide community engagement is second to none. And so now I'm going to speak a little bit about some of the scenes happening around the world where individuals are taking the methods of creativity into their own hands and determining that they do not need necessarily all of the infrastructures of the world of commerce to make a point intelligently, thoughtfully, and viscerally to the audiences that they're trying to reach. First, I'm going to speak about Dojinshi, which is Japanese hobby publishing. It's important to understand that in Japan, comics are a mass media second only to television. Anywhere you go in the country, you will encounter adults, children, old folks, everybody in between reading comics in some fashion. There's a great familiarity with this medium, and there is a powerful publishing industry behind it. But beside that publishing industry stands hobby publishing, which is also known there as Dojinshi. And these are, basically speaking, self-published comics that are produced by either individuals or what are called circles, so groups of individuals, that go off and exhibit their wares at Dojinshi marketplaces. The biggest one is called Comiket, or the Comic Market, and that's where the pictures you see here come from. I've had the opportunity to visit in 2013, and this takes up the Tokyo Big Sight, which is a convention hall that looks exactly like a UFO landed on an island off of Tokyo. And 500,000 people per day of this 3-day event crowd through this massive environment to enthusiastically consume the work of tens of thousands of creative people every day. And the way that Comiket is set up is that it's 3 days, and each day has completely different exhibitors. So if you're an artist circle, and you've got your half table, so 3 feet. Forgive my ugly Americanism for not knowing the centimeters and meters. That times some 3,000 per day. So we're talking upwards of 10,000 creative people per day standing behind a table, offering their lovingly constructed comic that isn't where they make their living. This is just their power, their vocation, to 500,000 people coming through for it. And then the next day, it's a whole different group of thousands of exhibitors and a whole different group of 500,000 individuals. And they do that for 3 days, 2 times a year. And the Dojinshi here is a variety that includes either adaptations or derivatives or fan fiction about popular and established manga stories and brands, but it also includes personal visions. And for that, there's a 4 times a year event called Komitia, which is a fraction of the size of Comic Market, but still healthy, still some hundreds and hundreds of exhibitors dealing with some tens of thousands of viewers coming in for work that is wholly original and wholly made by the individuals that are creating it. And so now let's just back up a little bit and look at the numbers. So Japan, of course, sells hundreds of millions of manga books every year, and they have done for more than 50 years. So that's a lot of visual culture happening there. But in terms of just the Komitia and the Comiket, you're looking at maybe 100,000 circles a year. So you're looking at literally hundreds of thousands of people that work as mailmen or that work as clerks or that work as salary men and women creating these art pieces because of a calling deep within themselves, not because they are necessarily going to be deriving a living from it. And here's some of them now. You can see the look is very humble. It's simple tables. It's people producing work that is personally meaningful to them. Of course, we're blessed in an era where printing technology has never been cheaper. And so, good Lord, we might as well make use of it. The Japanese definitely do. And so here they are setting up their work that they've got 6 or 7 hours to sell until it moves off into the hands of the folks that appreciate it. And so here are just some of the end products that you see. Down here is the reading library at a Komitia, where they take all of the pieces that were constructed within that year's show and offer them for folks to take a look at. This is a Dojinshi store in Akihabara district in Tokyo. And this is where the Dojinshi go on a secondary market for folks that couldn't make it to the convention in the first place and are purchasing it. Over there is a table at the Komitia of handmade comics as well. And at the bottom you see an image I yanked off of the internet of a fan proudly displaying the comics that they bought there that day. So the power of comics isn't just limited to the permission structures of large commerce. The power of comics is also what individuals are driven to make. And it's not only in Japan that we see this. Throughout the world, we're seeing an increase in small press comics festivals that are growing in vital places for individuals to create their own artistic vision, as well as for smaller publishers who are known as micro-publishers to create work that is speaking to these audiences as well. Here is TCAF, the Toronto Comic Art Festival, where it takes over a library in downtown Toronto for a full weekend every May. And this is one of the larger ones in the United States, but by no means the only one. We also have the Small Press Expo in Bethesda, Maryland, the MoCA convention in New York City, and dozens more throughout the country throughout the year. But this is also spreading globally. Sweden has their own SPX. Oslo has its comics festival here, although I'm not sure how much independent publishing happens there. So if somebody's connected with it, please talk to me after. I want to learn. As well as UK events as well, such as the Lakes International Comics Festival and the Thought Bubble Festival. So these small press comics festivals provide an environment for folks to do similar to what the Japanese are doing, but growing out of more of an influence from the zine space or the self-published, self-produced, Xeroxed, and otherwise small-run copied space for creating media. And so here are just a few examples, and they range from stuff run off on a photocopy machine to hand-sewn binding, to silkscreen covers, to hand-painted covers, a full range of expression that, again, doesn't require a larger infrastructure. It creates an opportunity for artists from all media, whether they are enamored of comic books or whether they are fine artists, to take their hand at this medium and really say something that is meaningful to them. And so here are some of those people. They look exactly like the faces I'm seeing in this room today. They come from all walks of life. They come from all walks of creativity. So this here is Annie Koyama. She publishes Koyama Press. She's a publisher based out of Toronto in Canada. And this is a person who is simply powerfully motivated as a hobby publisher to find voices that are meaningful to her and bring them out in editions that are then offered, at these events. Here also are some other creators that are putting out their own wares at these shows. So it's a vital community, it's a vital way of speaking, and it's a vital way of coming together. Because one of the really interesting things, of course, about the festival aspect of comics is that it really thrives on peer engagement. It isn't merely consumers, and that's true in Japan as well. It's not just about, I'm a big fan of this, I'm going to buy it and I'm going to talk about it, the way that you almost have to do with motion pictures, the way you almost have to do with television. These are people that are making and reading and responding to each other in both the printed form of what they're making, but also in simply getting together at these events and comparing craft notes at room parties until 6 o'clock in the morning. And so here you see the power of comics to bring people together, to create this very thin line between the enthusiast and the creator. And that's the final part that I think is so deeply interesting and powerful about the comics art form, is that it requires nothing of you than the willingness to put yourself out there and try to do something. All that is necessary is the ability to make pages that have whatever degree of meaning you want to put on them, and to share them with your peers, and to be willing to grow from there. Now, I was just talking, of course, about the realm of ink, because that is, of course, this month's theme. But even beyond that, there's an entire universe of story and art and creativity within the webcomic space. This is just a simple Google image search from earlier this morning that I chose to open up this section because it shows just this huge diversity. You enter this in and there's all kinds of category. There's millions upon millions upon millions of image files of people that are taking to this technology to say something. They don't even need the resources, the $40, the 500 kroner to go ahead and make a small print run. They simply are taking this file and putting it out on their blogs or on Tumblr or anywhere else and reaching an audience. And here you see a small range of some of the creativity there that, again, reflects anybody can come to this. I chose people whose art I happen to like, but there's all kinds of taste and there's all kinds of art, and all of it is of equal merit. And that's the thing, that there is an egalitarian nature to comics. There is an ability for comics to simply thrive because the community of makers wants it to. And there's a whole spectrum within that ranges from the person that is making their 25 copies of a zine or of a mini comic or of a silk-screened art codex, and they move it to their 25 friends, and that's fine. They're good with that. That's all that they need from this medium. And then, of course, there are others that are creating narratives that are translated into dozens of languages and reaching out to people that are getting inspiration from somebody else's life experience and inserting it into their own life experience and then in turn being inspired by it. And then, of course, you also have the people that are creating the work that is adapted and made into the mass media that people are addictively tuning into, like Robert Kirkman with The Walking Dead, who had this dopey idea about a zombie apocalypse that went on to become a phenomenon. So all things really are possible here. All things really are possible in this visual medium for this visual century, for those with the desire to communicate in images, for those with the humility and the willingness to learn through doing, and for those with the courage to share with everybody that is willing to take a chance and open up the book in front of them or click on the URL in front of them. And that's really unique, and that's really special. That is a form of community. That is a form of story that is actively changing the world right now. That's not hyperbole. When you look at the effect of people that are reading Alison Bechdel and walking up to her in tears and saying, "Thank you, you gave me the courage to find who I am, to be myself." When you see people that are inspired by Hergé and deciding as a kid, I want to do that, and growing up and making massive stories that they can then inspire the next generation with, that is a powerful form. There's any number of ways to approach it, but however you do, by approaching it with open eyes, humility, and enthusiasm, you can make a difference with comics, or comics can make a difference in you. Thank you for your time this morning.